Now, in summary of last time, this is the second in a two-part series, and the last. Last time we looked at a few limits to authority, and one of them was the question formed by the question: what is the purpose of ruling authority? Can anyone answer me this? What is the purpose for which we discussed that ruling authority is given its great power?
So that people can live in peace.
Yeah, that's one of them. And how does and flesh that out a bit more so that people can live in peace? Can you develop that a bit more, or someone else want to chip in and build on that? Yeah, in the interest of people, in particular, if you can use the language of Romans 13 and 1 Peter, what does it say? It kind of says that, but it says it in slightly different words. You want to keep Romans 13 probably open.
So to keep law, to keep law.
Yeah. So. Yeah, and how does it phrase it?
On behalf of God.
They're acting on behalf of God. Yeah, so they're acting. We could put God at the top, really. Whoosh, God's at the top, and to keep law. And how does it describe it in Romans 13? There's a similar phrase it uses in both Romans 13 and 1 Peter 3. Punishing wrongdoing. Yes, it says to punish evil. And evil, that's it. So to punish evil. There we go. Let's get the punishers in. Whoosh. We have our judge, who interprets the law and applies it. And and he punishes wrongdoing, and perhaps his agents are perhaps the police. Oh, I think I gave it. Did I give the Lego policeman? No, I didn't. Yeah, so he's there to punish evil. So if we at the bottom do go stray, or someone's trying to kill your family, they're there to protect you. They're there to stop your family being killed, which is a good thing. People there to protect, to restrain evil and punish. It says punish evildoers. And they do not bear the sword in vain. They bear the truncheon in this case, but the truncheon's a picture of the sword. Yeah. Okay. So that's one of the great limits that's placed, and the purpose of ruling authority is also a limit. Who defines good and evil? This was God defines it, and that's another massive limit. Who defines it? The state does not define it. When we looked at Romans 12:21, just beforehand, he said, do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. And we say that from that context, clearly Paul is thinking about evil and good in the context of how God defines it. And you could read it earlier and you see the same. So it is God that defines it. Hence we've got God at the top. And we had underneath, which Jessica and others helpfully said, was you could put underneath the thing that God is the Ten Commandments, but really Christ, it's really, you could put, in fact, I should put it. You could put what would Jesus do on it. So we could, because what would Jesus do is in fact, what would Jesus do? There you go. Oh, you can't really see it. You get the idea. It's important because Jesus, what would Jesus do? He perfectly fulfilled the law. He shows the two great commandments, love God and love your neighbor. He perfectly fulfills them. So he's the supreme definition. The Ten Commandments is a thing, but it's really on the cross and in the life of Christ that we fully understand the intent of God's law, which is love God and love your neighbor. So yeah, so that's another great and really powerful and helpful in there. We looked at Romans 13:8-10 and how he immediately goes on to talk about love, fulfilling the law, and loving your neighbor as yourself and so on. Yeah, that's another. And then we did what we've done now. We came up with this stack, or as England helpfully called it, the chain governing authorities in any society. And in fact, although we put the judge under Boris, who's symbolic of the government, really Boris is also, he's in the executive and under the separation of powers. And also you'd have typically the Houses of Parliament as the legislature. You used to have the House of Lords as a check on them as well. They were all meant to be checked. So in separation of powers theory, you kind of have them all on their side to check each other, so that the states can't go rogue. And that's built on historic Christian theology, which has a low view of man. Like Lord Acton says, power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely, is a Christian worldview, and it leads to having checks and balances in a society. It built the West. This theology had political ramifications, and it changed our world, and it gave us a lot of the wonderful heritage we've enjoyed for many hundreds of years. So the military take an oath to the Queen, actually, who's again kind of separate. They can symbolize the Queen. So we have multiple things, limits within this stack, and we also looked at the people. But the people actually, what's their special role? The people in this, they have their role at the bottom of the stack, but also we looked at another aspect of the people.
I think the people, we took it as, first of all, parents to teach the children.
Yeah, so in a separate sphere, yeah, they're in a different area. They're like this, in families. Yeah.
Families. And also at the same time, as Kirsten's stepmother was saying, that the people are the one who actually choose who they want them to be.
Yeah.
In authority over them.
Yeah.
But overall, as the lady was saying, God is the one who had to choose.
Yeah. Yeah. So God's in absolute control over everything, whatever we do. But humanly speaking, we do have this thing of the people in it, certainly in democracies, but even before democracies, we looked at when Saul was first made king, it was the people that made him king. And when Athaliah was removed from being queen, it was the people. With the high priest, the people formed a covenant to remove so the priest was arguably one of these. He was underneath the king, and they removed them. So in a democracy, the people have it's acknowledged the people have king-making power. We make governments. The legitimacy of the legislature depends on people, and that's all within the orbit of the biblical theology of political rights and responsibilities that comes out of the scriptures, and which Romans 13 and 1 Peter 2 are just a part. They're a part that surfaces in the New Testament, but they follow a long stream of developed thinking in this area, for which we have great thanks to give to God. And then we looked at where does the attitude of Christ fit in, and we didn't really touch on, but we kind of began little hints at, and there I want to really focus on what is abusive authority, state authority, versus servanthood. And we looked a bit about Christ being abolitional, Satan being abusively coercive, and that authorities, when they go this way, when a state tends towards, as we noticed with British values, they tend towards values that are opposed to Christ and more like Satan's, then you're going to get that authority reflecting its author, and vice versa. And God set up, like he set up the father in the family to be a servant to the children and of the wife, to love the wife as Christ loved the church. So he set up the state. It is to serve society by protecting you, by looking out for your best interests. We elect people over us to govern in our interests, not the other way around. And so it should be a shepherd. There's a sense in which it should be a shepherd, not a heavy shepherd or a state cult. And we've seen those arise in history, and they happen. So today I want to kind of give you, I meant to bring it along. Has anyone got like a CO test, a carbon monoxide test, a little thing? It's a little white thing, and that's an angel. Oh, there's one in the kitchen. I'll get it. Okay. No one. It's attached. Maybe it's attached to the wall. It's attached to the wall, so I can't get it. It's attached to the wall.
You can take it because it's got batteries behind.
But I imagine I was holding this carbon monoxide detector. What is it there for? Why would you have one? Who's got one in their home? Ooh, quite a lot of you. Quite a lot. Not everybody, but quite a lot. Why have you got one in your home? You don't want to be poisoned. Yeah? Yeah, you don't want to be poisoned. It's a gas. You can't smell it. You can't taste it, but it can kill you. And if you've had friends who suffered carbon monoxide poisoning, it's a horrendous thing, and can cause profound damage. You get out. Yeah, get out. That's it. So that's really helpful. And that's what I was thinking of. That I want to try, and today my job is to try and give you a CO test in this area, so that I open the doors, I leg it out, I open all my doors, and I get everybody else out of the house, and I turn, and then maybe one of us goes back in to turn the gas off once it's cleared, and then we let it, but then we let it clear. So once, that's the aim. And I want to help us to think that if a crisis occurs, and and I think it will occur in the next 10 to 20, 50 years, you're going to face it because of the direction of society. It's running at odds with God. Then when it occurs, I want you to think, oh, hang on a tick, that's not lawful or binding. And I want you to be freed in your conscience to know what is lawful and what's not. So we looked at the purpose of ruling authority, and I didn't put so much talk about it as a limit. I just talked about it as its purpose. But he gave it a ministry of justice and defense, really, to protect the evildoer. So that would count for foreign invasions too. It's a key limit of legitimate biblical authority. It's not you might be able to derive authority in other areas, but not from these texts. It is not a ministry of truth. Yeah, it doesn't decide what's true and what is not true. You don't. It's not that no one won't do so. It's not. Oh, I'm running out of power. It's not a ministry of health. It's not a ministry of welfare. It's not a ministry of transport, of business. Oh, thank you, David. But it may help with education, but it's not. God has not assigned the government the role of education or the role of health or welfare or healthcare, etc. They can be good things in themselves, but they can also be weaponized against their citizenry. So that's it. It's just useful to think about that. What is Romans 13 talking about, and are they outside their orbit of authority? Then the attitude of Christ we've kind of looked at, but I think it's really important to look at that 2 Peter verse that we looked at with the children. It says, and you can think of John Bunyan, if because of conscience towards God one endures grief and suffers wrongly. And verse 20 says, you're punished for doing good. It doesn't say, submit yourselves to governments, even if it means searing your conscience to avoid enduring grief or suffering wrongfully. Now it says exactly the opposite. If because of conscience sake you have to endure grief or suffer wrongfully, then do so, and do so patiently. So it doesn't say do good lest you suffer. Don't do good lest you suffer, but it says do good and suffer. Follow conscience toward God and endure grief. Let me quote a brother. I submit that an individual who breaks a law that conscience tells him is unjust and willingly accepts the penalty by staying in jail to arouse the conscience of the community over its injustice is in reality expressing the very highest respect for law. And that's Martin Luther King. But I hope you see that it could have been John Bunyan. 12 years in jail, his blind daughter, his poor wife. But you can see his respect for law, his desire to bless society. Lesser magistrates and the prophetic role of pastors is another area we barely touched on, but I just wanted, before coming to the main thread today, I wanted to touch on this. And I wanted to take you through a few books and teachers. Zwingli, I wanted to start with, a German reformer. And he said, as the Spartans had their ephors, the Romans their tribunes, and the German towns their guildmasters with the authority to check the higher ruler, so God has provided pastors to stand on guard for the people. Now, it's really interesting. Even guys like, I think it was either Aristotle, I think it was, or said that the ephors were like a God-given thing in Sparta. Their sole role was they had no job unless the king got out of hand. And if the king got out of hand, they were to oppose him. And secular people said this is like a divine blessing for our society. But the reformers, to a man, picked up on these things, and they said these are clear indicators of people with authority other than the king, whose proper use is to protect the people from the king. If the king goes crazy, they need to deal with him. And it's really interesting here what Zwingli does is he says that God, in the same way that these are a role, he actually says pastors are a role, have a similar role. But pastors have a similar role and should be in there as a check. That God has provided pastors to check these things. And you might want to think over in your head, what are the prophets like across the Bible? Do they call out the evil of kings?
Yes, they did.
Can you think of examples?
David.
So who are you thinking of? Nathan. Yeah, Nathan. Yeah, sorry, let me asking the question, give me the answer. Yeah, what does Samuel do? He confronts Saul. When? Brilliant example. Saul meddles in religion, not his role. Saul, that's not your role. You're here to govern the people. You're not here to take over the priestly role. And he challenges him and tells him his role. Yeah. So yeah, that's some great examples. Any more?
And even in those days, the king had every authority to cut your head off.
Yeah. Yeah.
But yet, it's this stand.
Yeah. Challenging. Can you think of any more sort of prophetic examples? Jeremiah? And what does Jeremiah do?
He wrote to Saul and he said to the king, and the king, he told this is going to happen to you if you don't listen to God. And he didn't, he just burned the book and he wrote it again.
Yeah.
But this time he wrote what's going to happen to him as well.
Yeah, he gets worse. The second release, the first one's burned for sort of treason, and the second release is even worse. It's like, well, and he added many more of these words to it. And it's like, and he says, Jeremiah says to the people, he says, leave, go and join Babylon. It's treason. He doesn't leave this town, go and join Babylon. This place is gone. Go and join Babylon. Yeah, so there are many examples. We could spend all day going through the examples, if you think about it, of prophets challenging kings and challenging the kings of Israel and the kings of Judah. So I just want to show you that what Zwingli says there in a summary has legitimacy. And when Jesus says, he says, blessed are you when you're persecuted for righteousness, for so they persecuted, for my name's sake, for so they persecuted the prophets who were before you. Jesus sees his disciples and you guys as following in the line of the prophets. He doesn't say that, but he says, so they persecuted the prophets who were before you. Similar things. There's a continuation. Zwingli doesn't extend it to all the people, but he says, certainly, pastors have that role. So, yeah, I'm trying to show you this is clear, legitimate biblical teaching, and it transformed our world. I forgot to bring my CO meter, but I also forgot to bring Calvin's Institutes with me, which is probably saved you, because I was going to read Calvin from Calvin, because Calvin's brilliant on this. His whole last chapter, the last words of his the Institutes of Calvin are on civil government, and his very last two things are on dealing with tyranny and how to respond to tyranny. And he says, if guys like this, I'm summarizing for you, which is probably doing you a favor, though his writing's beautiful. He uses words like nefarious perfidy. It's a translation of the Latin, but it's still probably a flowing Latin, or maybe he wrote it. No, I think he wrote it in Latin rather than French. He says if these guys don't resist the king when the king is being abusive, he said this is nefarious perfidy. It's wickedness. They're failing in their role. And then he went on to say that, of course, the people must obey even evil rulers unless they cross a line and they ask you to do something which leads you away from God. So if they, and this is in a sense you could draw a line. There's like a religion. Here's the ministry of justice. If they start to meddle with religion and start to become a ministry of religion, he's like, at that point, if they're messing with you and your relationship and how you meet with and worship God, don't go there. If they're pulling you away in any behavior, they're asking, if they're pulling you away from God, have nothing to do with it. And he starts to use examples. He says, when Jeroboam pulled Israel away, he set up new gods. The people it was held against the people that they allowed it. Later, he said, you followed his two golden calves. He said, here are your gods. He set one up at Dan and one at Samaria. And he said, these are what delivered you. And he said, no, you allowed it. And the prophets later challenged the people. It is not enough for the people to say, oh, no, our leaders did that. We were powerless. He said, no, you should have torn those altars down. You should have stopped them. That you had a responsibility. So yeah, that's how Calvin ends. And he says, I don't think I lightly say this. I know what it is to be afraid of kings and to get their anger and to suffer. And you'll see his, I can send around his last words later because they're interesting. And it's interesting that that's how he chooses to end his book. Then we could look, there are some other key moments in history. Just a couple of books. I'm not going to reference their ideas. I'll just read you their titles. In 1572, does anyone know what happened in 1572? Of great importance to Christianity, the Reformation. Sorry, the Diet of Worms was 1520. It happened 50 years earlier. This was St. Bartholomew's Day's massacre. 10 to 15,000 Christians, Huguenot Christians, were killed in France. 7 years later, the Huguenots produced a book. They'd been thinking about it, obviously. They didn't do it in a rush. They've been thinking about it. And they produced a book called Vindiciae contra Tyrannos, which is legal remedies against tyrants. Or the subtitle was The Lawful Power of the Prince over the People and of the People over the Prince. So that's his title. You can guess where that went. But it became a founding stone of later the foundation of America as well, and other thinkers. And then in 1644, we had a book in England come up called Lex Rex. And Lex Rex means law is king. It used to be Rex Lex, which means king is law. Yeah, divine right of kings. I'm the king, I am law. I'm above the law, as we were talking about last week. Some people think they're above the law. They would say, I am law. And this guy called Samuel Rutherford, who's a Scottish preacher, apparently a really humble guy and just a gentle guy. And they wanted to kill him, but he died before they could kill him, which was unfortunate for them. But he wrote Lex Rex, and its subtitle was The Law and the Prince, a dispute for the just prerogative of the just rights of the king and the people. So these are some of the great books. I've left out some of them, but they're some of the great books that upon which our heritage and our free West is built. And it wasn't freed in a night, but the trajectory of the West was influenced very, very heavily by these things. The prophets, another man, as some of you know, is famous for saying the church is to be a thermostat, not a thermometer. It's not merely to say, oh, it's getting a bit hot or it's getting a bit cold. No. We're to be more active than that. We're to be a thermostat. We're to control the temperature. We're saying it's getting hot, let's cool it down. It's getting cool, let's heat it up, or what have you. And you can see that path. So now we're coming onto the main thread of what I wanted to talk about today, which is this this CO meter, which is the stealing of religious authority. And we've kind of touched on it already. But when the state crosses outside its ministry of justice and starts to mess with religion, we looked at the family before. Like if the state tells every family member that they must eat at 5 p.m., would you think that's cool? Is that the state's right to tell you must all have your meal at 5? No, it's not the state's right. That's right. They can't do that. They've crossed the line. And we looked at on our children's talk last week, we looked at how in God's providence and wisdom, the people that have the most authority over us in life love us the most and know us the most. My parents, while I lived under them, my parents had the most authority over me, and they loved me and knew me the most. And it's the same with you, ideally. Sometimes we have dysfunctional, painful families where that's not the case. But that is God's ideal, is that the people who have the most power over you love you the most. And so there's less power for the pastors of church over churches. We have less power, less authority, and it's more we're trying to be instructive and guide the hearts of man. It's heavy shepherding if I tell you you must do that. Everyone recognizes that as abuse of authority. And in the same way, the state has even less power and influence over your day-to-day, unless you commit a crime. If you commit a crime, then you cross into its prerogative. If you don't commit a crime, you don't come into its territory. And if they criminalize everything, well, we got another kind of problem. But religion, the classic problem in the scriptures is where they intervene with religion. And you can think of it. Uzzah touches the ark. What happens to him? He dies instantly. We looked at Saul. It was another of my great examples. He offers sacrifices. He may be a king. He's just crossed the line. It says divination is as the sin of witchcraft. Rebellion is as the sin of witchcraft. So it's associated with the king is rebelling. You could think he's got all authority to do that. No. He has limited authority within his sphere. If the king crosses into religion, he has exceeded his bounds. Can you think of another famous example? John the Baptist. So that's an example where they're upset in the New Testament. He's saying the truth. Yeah.
He didn't want to kill him, but then he ended up killing him because he was under circumstances. But again,
yeah.
It's example of somebody saying the truth and saying no.
Yeah. Yeah, and they're not happy. They don't like that, so they decide to kill a preacher for telling the truth.
And I think of Daniel. Daniel had to leave for the people to go back from the captivity, and he was there and he's been there for 4 kingdoms, and he was there all the time, and he still kept his position, and he kept helping his people, so they're all back to.
Daniel's a great example, and we're going to get into him. He's the focus really of where we're coming to. This is all just backstory to build up to Daniel, because he's such a great example, as you say. You could think of Uzziah and Azariah, another king who touched the altar, and as soon as he touched the altar, as soon as he came up to the incense, I forget the details. Was it touching the altar?
You talk about the sons of Aaron.
No, there's a guy called Uzziah or Azariah. Oh, yeah, you got those examples in Moses' day.
The sons of Aaron died as well.
Yeah, his 2 sons. But they were priests, but they decided to do it in their own way. They breached the law. Yeah. So there are numerous examples, and it's good to think about them. You might want to talk about this afterwards and raise questions.
Thomas Charles I triggering this law by marching into Parliament to demand the members' presence. His famous comment, "I see the birds have flown."
That's not necessarily about religion. I'm now looking particularly. Our particular interest is the stealing of religious authority. Because when the state tends to do it, it tends to be its focus.
And the sons of Samuel, they were when they were coming with the sacrifice, they were taking their position to take their fat out.
So this is corruption.
They were watching. They were using their position to do what they wanted.
And that's there's a difference here between corruption. It is abuse of authority. It's abuse of their authority, but it is rightly their domain. So they're corruptly operating within their domain, but it's still something you can call out. And we could see clearly the scripture, and they would be rejected for that, yeah, and they die.
God's people rather than
Yes, exactly. And there's a distinction. So there's a distinction. So what I'm really,
the church.
yeah, that's inside the church. And what we're really interested in here is what are the wider principles where you see the political king crossing over boundaries into the state. And that's what we're really going to look at. Not so much. So hence Azariah becoming leprous because he tries to take on a role that's not his, not because he corruptly uses it.
When Jeroboam's child, when after Jeroboam, I think it was his son tried to say, I'm the last of Jeroboam, I can become king, and he killed all his brothers and everything just to become king. No,
lots of them do that. Again, that's a war within the political realm, that's not crossing the religious political. So what we're really going to explore is this religious political divide.
Well, actually, I was thinking about Pharaoh. When God said, you have to do God, to go and worship him. And Pharaoh said, no. Guess what happened?
And Pharaoh says, you can go, but just with your men. Or you can go, but not with your flocks.
No, he's giving his own authority, his own law.
About how he said you can go and worship God, but in the way that I describe it. That's used as a classic example of a king meddling in worship. So that is an example that's used widely. All of these are classically used by our Reformed forefathers. So this is your history. Protestant came from the letter of protestation by German Lutheran princes in 1529 against the Diet of Speyer, which condemned Lutheran teachings. English dissenters, such as the Puritans, violated the political act of uniformity in 1659 and 1662, and they were then called nonconformists and dissenters. 2,500 ministers were cast out as a result in 1662 in what was called the Great Ejection on the 24th of August. We're coming up to its to an anniversary. In the late 19th century, these terms were replaced by free church and free churchmen, or the idea of independent. That's the heritage of these words that we identify with. It is in these men and in these times. Daniel 6, so I really wanted to look at with care. And there are 3 verses in it I want to look at particularly. And Daniel 6 verse 5 would be the first one. There's hidden motives and there's hidden singling out, which perhaps Daniel only discovered after the event, and the king only realized after the event. And it says in 6 verse 5, we shall not find any charge against this Daniel unless we find it against him concerning the law of his God. Now we know in hindsight reading it that this was the motive for the law, but we also know that it wasn't the king's motive, because he was taken completely blindsided and like, oh my goodness, I'm having to kill Daniel. This is like a disaster. And he realized he'd been tricked. He was grieved when it was used the way it was. But that made no difference to Daniel. The king meant well. He'd been tricked. Oh, I'll keep it because it's not what he meant by it. And it's only 30 days. The king didn't mean to stitch me up and put me in a difficult place. Doesn't make a difference to Daniel about the motives or the singling out. And then there's hidden or continued public practice. And it's an interesting question. 6 verse 10, chapter 6 verse 10. Now when Daniel knew that the writing was signed, he went home, and in his upper room with his windows open toward Jerusalem, he knelt down on his knees 3 times that day and prayed and gave thanks before his God, as was his custom since early days. Okay, now this is me imagining I'm Daniel. Okay, there's little gain by visiting lions for a trick law meant to catch me out, though the king doesn't know it. Where then will be the precious influence God has in this kingdom? By me being at Darius' side, I'll go to a locked inner room with no windows. Windows aren't required at all. I don't even have to pray towards Jerusalem. That was only Solomon's request in prayer. All could pray before Solomon asked that after all. I can pray to God anywhere and he will hear, like Abraham and David did, like Jonah in the big fish. Do I really think he prayed towards Jerusalem literally in the big fish, or was it not in his heart? Like mine will be. And I'll pray internally in my heart, not out loud, so that anyone can hear, so that no one can hear me. And if I only do it once a day, it won't look too suspicious. No one need know that we're breaking the law of the Medes and the Persians. I'll look totally compliant, but no one can stop me following God, not even these laws. And by the way, I'm not trying to draw any permanent rules from Daniel's example. I'm merely trying there are clear, you'll find in the scriptures, there's clearly situational wisdom and secrecy can be used at times. You'll find it in Jesus's life. Sometimes he came up to the feast in secret and so on. He's wise and careful. We're just looking at Daniel as an example. It does show that Daniel considered that such a public, open witness was not just okay, but was godly wisdom. And his wisdom was, yes, sister.
The same with Mordecai. He said to Esther, don't tell that you're a Jew, but in the same time, he would bow down to him because you are a Jew, and he wanted to let him know. So it's... Yeah.
So there can be wisdom that can be applied in different circumstances differently. Exactly. But what you see, what it does show is that Daniel considered that such he was also viewed as wise. Ezekiel says, behold, of the king of Tyre, when the king of Tyre thinks he's really clever, Ezekiel says, behold, to the king of Tyre, behold, you are wiser than Daniel. No secret is hidden from you. But Daniel had a reputation, even in Ezekiel, as being super wise and super bright. So we know that it can be a super wise path to Daniel to do what he did and risking everything. If God didn't deliver him from the lions, his influence in that kingdom was gone. It was over. What's really interesting to see in terms of law and authority is the unlawful laws are not law. Daniel 6:22 says, I was found innocent before him, before God, and also, O king, I have done no wrong before you. And this parallels Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego's response to Nebuchadnezzar many years before, who said, we have no need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. The implication is, though they had at one level disobeyed him, they'd in no way dishonored him or even disobeyed him. He says, I'm innocent. O king, I have done no wrong before you. I have done no wrong. The implication is, if he had obeyed the king, he would have done wrong before him. Because when a king gives a law that is against God's laws, if you obey him, you support him in evil. And therefore, actually, to disobey an evil law is a good thing and honors the person who gives the law. This is important teaching. I'm going to develop this a bit. So are you with me on this? Yeah? Let me... It's not law. You think we're disobeying, but you just disagree on it. It's a secular guy says they are lovers of law who observe the law when the government breaks it. Augustine said an unjust law is no law at all. You could think of New Testament examples, and they're really worth doing here. So we're just going to look at two of them, maybe three, very briefly. 2 Corinthians 11:32. Let me just read it out to you, the two verses. In Damascus, Paul says, in Damascus, the governor under King Aretas had the city of the Damascenes guarded in order to arrest me. But I was lowered in a basket from a window in the wall and slipped through their hands. That tells you that Paul repeats this. He did it. You can say, oh, I did it as an early Christian. I was misguided. I should have gone and handed myself into the authorities. No, there doesn't seem to be any regrets about it as he repeats it to the Corinthian believers later. This teaches that it can be just to evade arrest if it's baseless and false. If it's on false and baseless grounds, you do not have to go and hand yourself into the police station. That is not an obligation if you know they're wanting to arrest you. Again, you could think of it, Acts 12. Peter is imprisoned. He's got 4 men guarding him during the 4 watches of the night, 4 different men each watch. 4 men guard him. He's going to be killed. That's the aim. James has been killed just earlier. An angel frees him, takes him out of jail, leaves him in the streets, and then he goes and he meets Rhoda, and Rhoda's like, what? And they say, no, it must be a ghost. It's angel. And no, it's really Peter. And then he goes elsewhere, it says. He doesn't hang around. He doesn't go back to the jail and say, hey guys, I'm out of jail, but I know that you want me in jail, so here, come put me back in jail. He doesn't do that, does he? Because it's an unlawful law, and to support unlawful laws is to support obedience to Satan, which is wrong. And so he's not found there. And what he could even have said, because what happens immediately following is 4 guards lose their lives. They're killed over it. Four men die. That angel freed Paul at the cost of 4 lives. He could have said, hey, I'm going to hand myself in because otherwise the guards are going to die. You know, I should hand myself in. But he didn't. That's on them. Their involvement. And I imagine, just incidentally, I imagine afterwards it made people go, who wants the job of guarding the Christian? You know what? I talked to the other 3 that survived, the other 3 groups of 4. It's like, I'm not down with that. You're not going to get me to guard that guy. They can get out when no one can possibly organize it, and I'm going to lose my life for it. I don't want to lose my life. Thank you. You guard him. I don't know how it went, but God in his wisdom organizes these things. Then consider this. Let me read you a text. Jesus knew that the chief priests were seeking to arrest him, so he went down to their guard offices privately so as to make it easy for them, and handed himself in. Do you read that in your scriptures? No, you don't. We know that Jesus knew they wanted to arrest him. We know that they wanted to arrest him in private so as not to be awkward because of the fear of the people. Did he make it easy? Did he say, oh, I heard there's a warrant now. I'll go and let it be easy for you. I'll not make a scene. No. A lawless law should not be submitted to. Lawless, evil desires, when they cross into religion, you don't submit to them. That is not the pattern that we see in scriptures. Jesus, when he's in their hands as a slave bound before his master, then he submits. He's like, do it as you will. I'm in your hands. I'm powerless. Now do as you will. But I'm not going to hand myself over to an evil regime and evil authorities. I'm not going to make it easy for you. Yeah. I think these are really interesting. And for me, they're really liberating about when the state starts to intrude on religion. It's just not lawful. I have no need to answer you in this matter. You can portray me as disobeying you. I have no need to answer you in this matter. We're not disrespecting you in any way. We're innocent before you. And yeah, so I just wanted to conclude. I hope you enjoy this stuff. I find it really amazing. This is the heritage that our God has given us. The appeasement of tyranny, which happened with Hitler, it's just not the path that God teaches in the scripture. It's certainly not supported by Romans 13 or 1 Peter 2 if properly understood. In fact, they form a vital pillar of the anti-tyrant teaching of Christianity. The West was freed and built by this God's teaching in this area. No one can infringe on religion. When the state comes into the church, it crosses a line. And I hope I put it in your heads, and now it'll go, meep. When they come in, you go, whoa, I know that's wrong. I know that's wrong. You're coming to our how we do church. You're coming into how we are together in our church. No, I know that's wrong. You crossed the line. I'm not disobeying your laws at that point. There are no laws at all. It was the very growth of this teaching, by the way, that led to the Bible in English. You know, the King James Version, he was terrified of the Geneva Bible with all its commentaries from all the great scholars like Calvin, like others, on the pages, telling them what these passages really meant and applying them from biblical theology. And he was terrified if this became the popular Bible, which it was becoming, there would be a popular revolution, and a popular revolution has legitimate authority. And so he thought, what can I do? I'll make a translation. I'll get it out there freely available because I've got a problem coming. And that's why you have the Bible. Bless the Lord for it. You have the Bible in English because of some of these teachings. And that changed the UK, obviously. That changed the dynamic. When the light and the word is so deeply in society, things change. And resistance to such lawless laws is an honorable, Christ-glorifying path of witness. It will free society. It brings his light to bear on Satan's darkness, and it's following Christ. It's the path he called us to. It's a battle that goes on from age to age and century to century, light versus darkness. Sometimes it's hotter, sometimes it's cooler, but it's always there. And there's this higher king, of the King of Kings, to which every king must bow and be in subjection to. They are all his ministers, and they must obey him. He is calling us to join this battle and to follow him. And perhaps he's calling us to suffer for doing good and to endure grief wrongfully for the sake of conscience towards God. And he led the way. He stands in the fire, and he holds out his hands scarred and pierced. And he reached out and says, come, pick up your cross and follow me. And in a hostile world, my path leads to enmity with the state. But I will be with you, and the Lamb has conquered. The Lamb reigns. And will you and I follow Jesus? You and I, we once gave blind obedience to the state, to the world system, to the devil's system, which is bigger than the state. It runs all the world. And at some point in our lives, we were giving blind obedience to Satan, not even knowing it. And we joined with the cause that crushed Jesus. And he gave everything to free us. Will we give everything to follow him? If the sufferings of Christ flow in our veins as a result, then so too will the life of Christ and the resurrection of Christ, and it will bless those around us. It's an honorable path to take, and it's trodden by many beautiful feet beforehand, and it's covered with blood, but it's beautiful, and it's a golden path, and it leads to the change. It leads to Christ's presence in society, and it leads to freedom of souls. That is the end.